I'm going to come at this question of perceptions by way of politics and picking up on some points that were made this morning. I mean, this paradox of journalism and politics, whereby, journalists have to resist political interference, but at the same time, the struggle for media freedom is very much a political struggle. The second point was one about solidarity that Aidan made, about the need for professional solidarity among journalists. Well, how do you achieve that? You achieve it through unions and representative bodies, which can only be set up freely in a certain political landscape, which again is a question of political struggle. And then a third point was Donatella's anecdote about being asked to sum up the Syrian situation in 2 minutes. That kind of, soundbite journalism that reduces political analysis, that reduces analysis of ideas to a kind of a media shorthand where we get these words Islamist, terror, and so on, used, in a kind of unthinking way, and they become part of a narrative that is, as it were, is foisted upon us and affects our perceptions and our understandings. And now, forgive me, but I think transition is just such a word. It reflects perceptions, and it reinforces perceptions, and it kind of fits with one of these narratives that we were talking about in one of the working groups on economic and social crisis. We were talking about the narrative of the euro and the narrative of strikes and so on. And so the challenge is to resist the narrative. The interesting thing is that the perception that is created by our use of certain terms is not necessarily shared. So if you look at the French and the English, you find the words tensions and transitions. If you look at the Arabic, you find the word crises and tahawalat, which is transformations, which I think is it's a different word. It doesn't have the baggage that the word transition has, and it is perhaps more descriptive. Now, I'm going to argue, and this is a bit of a polemic, but I'm going to argue that the word transition, it risks depoliticizing what's going on, and I'm going to come back to that. And also, it risks dehistoricizing, which is a big issue for media coverage. And Francesca spoke this morning about, how can you report on Nigeria if you can't talk about 100 years of history? Well, this idea of transition kind of cuts everything off. And the BBC did an internal review of its coverage of the so-called Arab Spring. And one of the conclusions that was drawn was that the BBC had not met its obligation to inform audiences about what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt in the years before the revolutions, and particularly in 2010. Now, everyone is using the word transition. I'm sure I use it too. It's not just used by journalists, it's used by think tanks, and I won't bore you with lots of examples. But the point, and why I feel a little bit of confidence in making this argument, is that the concept of transition itself has a history. So when the Arab uprisings took place, they were compared with the revolutions that had toppled regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of the 20th century. And the word transition was regularly used about what happened in Eastern and Central Europe. But as the 90s changed into the 2000s, that paradigm of transition was questioned and challenged. And apologies if you are already very familiar with this literature, But there was a seminal paper that was published in 2002 by Thomas Carruthers of the Carnegie Endowment. It was published in the Journal of Democracy, and it was called The End of the Transition Paradigm. And now, that's more than 10 years ago, but I just want to recap for you what Carruthers meant by the transition paradigm. He summarized it in 5 core assumptions. And if we look at those assumptions, we can see how unhelpful they are to understanding and for media coverage and for generating perceptions of what's going on. One is that any country that is moving away from dictatorship must automatically be moving towards democracy. A second assumption is that that transition to democracy occurs in a set of stages. So you get this platitude that transition takes time. A third assumption is that elections are the be-all and end-all of legitimizing the post-uprising situation and of widening political participation, that it only happens really through elections. A fourth, and this is really one of the things that resonates with me, is that when you talk of transition, the assumption is that you can overlook the legacy of the dictatorship, the demographics of the country, its history. And linked with that is the fifth assumption, which is that the assumption that somehow the state that functioned under the dictatorship can be modified but preserved in some form, whereas we know that the dictatorships were completely dysfunctional and that, the idea is to rebuild. You may have to actually rebuild from scratch. So by rehearsing those core assumptions of this term transition, Carruthers' conclusion from this was that we should be careful how we envisage what's going on. So instead of asking, how is the democratic transition going, if you want to have perceptions that are accurate and clear, the question you should be asking is, what is happening politically? And Carruthers' answer was that you had sort of 2 broad syndromes in a post-dictatorship situation. And one of those syndromes, he called it the syndrome of dominant power politics, whereby one political grouping, could be a movement, could be a party, dominates the system in such a way that there appears to be little alteration of power in the foreseeable future. And of course, people are disaffected from politics in that situation. A lot of the kind of skirmishing with government is done by advocacy, NGOs, and so on. And I guess that has a fairly familiar ring to people who are following events in the countries where there have been uprisings and their leaderships have been changed. So, for example, if you asked what is happening politically to media in Egypt, you will find that there is, in the institutions, there is not much of a transition going on, right? So you had a situation before where the state media were all appointees of the National Democratic Party, and now they're all appointees of the Freedom and Justice Party by virtue of elements of the Constitution that were maintained from before the uprising. If we look at the media system, people are still talking in kind of the institutional side of Egyptian media, still talking in terms of this kind of 3-way division, whereby there's government-owned media, which is described as national, as though it represents the national interest. Then, because there is very little alteration of government, the party political press becomes the opposition press, and then everything else is supposedly independent. And that situation continues. And then the whole question of media regulation, which again is a hugely political question, clearly the underlying structures need to be attended to, and there is need for rebuilding from scratch. And what is happening? People are talking about ethics and responsibility and how journalists should behave, and not about the structures and the situation in which journalists will conduct their profession. So just to recap, I wanted to make a plea that when we use the word transition, we remember the kind of historical baggage it brings with it, and the kind of assumptions, the whole question of assumptions that we make when we use these terms, because terms influence policies, they influence projects, they influence media narratives. And the word transition emphasizes change rather than continuity. It kind of suggests that there's a before and an after, and it makes us forget what one very well-informed writer has called the pathologies of dictatorship, that dysfunctional governance and the deep social divisions which are inherited from dictatorship because it was dictatorship. So I can give you more evidence of journalists, the journalist dissatisfaction with the kind of short-term lack of history, lack of follow-up journalism that is encapsulated in the idea of transition. But I think it's better to have more discussion than for me to continue longer. And that question that Carruthers asked, what is happening politically, it would encourage us to look at not just the dominant power, but also the alternative centers of power, and how the documentary makers, how the bloggers, how all the new creative generation of upcoming media practitioners, how can they link to those alternative centers of power? Thank you.